All this technology. All right, here we go. So let's look at the overview of American history at the time of the founding. What do we see happen? You have the colonial period. This is where we start. All kinds of people coming from Europe, mostly from England, but other European countries as well, settling in these remote lands across the ocean. Why? What's the main draw of the colonies at this time? Mostly to get rich, right? Plantations growing tobacco in the South, lots and lots of people coming just to make a bunch of money and go back to Europe. A lot of weirdos and social outcasts, and indeed, by the late 17th century, lots of slaves imported from the coast of West Africa. Again, also to make money for the people who purchased them. So yeah, we'll talk quite a bit about slavery later. Kansas-Nebraska Act, later the Civil Rights Act, a lot to say about that. But one group of people showed up in the northern colonies who came to stay, and they didn't come to get rich. They came for religious liberty. The Puritans settled in Massachusetts Bay, or what they thought was the northern parts of Virginia, right? It was way north. But they did it specifically to show themselves and the world that self-government was possible, that there really was a way to establish a community of people who could govern themselves. It was a very religious thing for them, obviously, being Puritans, but still, it set a very important precedent that the New World wasn't just a place to make money and go back. It wasn't just a place to dump your social outcasts. It really could be an extraordinary experiment in people governing themselves. So yeah, the colonial era then also features this, wait, what did I do? Sorry, yeah. Colonial era also features popping up in a lot of these colonies, assemblies. People of colonies electing officials, sometimes showing up themselves in state houses or assembly houses, and drafting bills and debating about the bills, trying to persuade each other and voting on it. Representatives going back to their constituents and trying to explain why they voted or didn't vote for this or that bill. We see this parliamentary kind of congressional practice deeply rooted in American culture early on. So in a lot of ways, Congress, as we'll study this semester, isn't just made by the Constitution. It's not just established by the government, big, beautiful Capitol Dome and all that. It has very old roots going back to a habit of deliberation and political life in American politics. It's very, very old. So the colonial era goes on and on. But then you enter the French and Indian War, which is kind of the Western theater of the 30 Years' War that was going on in Europe, where Britain was at war with France. France, of course, put up a lot of Native American tribes to fight the British in an attempt to try to push them out of North America. And a lot of Americans fought in this war as British subjects alongside Britons who came over from England in their bright red coats. And of course, the British were fighting for the glory of the empire. The American colonists were fighting for their homes and their farms and their families. As this war blew over, there was this growing sense that there's a real difference between us and our ancestors back in England. We're different. We're Americans. And the word American starts to become more common in this era. Colonists start to see themselves as a different kind of people. And so the French and Indian War winds down. Parliament realizes that they have a lot of debt. It's a very expensive war. And then maintaining the garrisons to try to continue protecting the colonies is very expensive. And so what do? You raise taxes on the colonists. It was a very common sense thing to do, but the colonists didn't see it that way. And so as we know, in the pre-revolution era, you had this growing tension between the American colonists and Britain, especially as the taxes were raised on tea and stamps, practically every piece of paper, right? You had to pay a tax on. And it got worse and worse. And finally, in 1770, the terrible incident in Boston where a whole bunch of protesters were yelling and screaming at a group of British troops. The troops felt threatened and they opened fire. And of course, you know the history behind this. The protesters were pretty out of control. They were throwing rocks at the troops, and supposedly what happened is one of the troops misunderstood. A colonist yelled, "Fire, I dare you, fire." And he thought it was his commanding officer. He pulled the trigger, and all the other troops pulled their triggers and killed a bunch of colonists in the Boston Massacre. You can still visit the spot today. Has anybody been there before? Downtown Boston. Yeah, what'd you think?
I went there a whole bunch of times. It was like I'm from the area,
Oh, yeah.
so it kind of gets boring after a while. Um, but I mean, it was kind of cool and kind of like sobering a little bit.
Yeah. If you're not from Boston, it's amazing. It's like, wow, the Boston. Yeah. But yeah, you stand there and you realize, like, this is where they were massacred. And that really was the incident that really got the ball rolling on the American Revolution. 1774, because of the tax on tea, you have a whole bunch of radical protesters known as the Sons of Liberty, right? It's like radical street politics. It's an all-American thing even today. Is it? They board the ship in the harbor and they grab a whole bunch of the tea that had the tax on it, shipped from China. They're dressed up as Native Americans and they throw it into Boston Harbor. And this was, of course, the Boston Tea Party. Parliament is outraged. The king is outraged. And so the intolerable acts are passed. And there will be more troops in the streets, and there will be tight regulations on everything Americans do and press and speech. And there will be royal governors that have an absolute veto over state assemblies. Britain really cracks down after the Boston Tea Party. Well, what happens next? Despite all of the hot-headed protest, kind of feelings, the Americans were cool enough to think ahead about what they were doing and select the first Continental Congress. So here it is, the first Congress, National Congress, right? Not a state assembly, but over the whole nation. And thus began the founding era proper. The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in that hall that you can still visit today. And they did two very important things early on. Actually, three things. First thing was to declare independence. And I realized the violence had already started, right? The shooting was already there, especially outside of Boston. But the Declaration of Independence came along and made it formal. And it lists the grievances against the king. And it lists the reason for separation from Britain, its independence. But then you get this very unusual paragraph, the second paragraph. I'm sure you've heard it before. We hold these truths to be our values, our beliefs. No, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? What is a self-evident truth? If I say a triangle has three sides, is that a self-evident truth? Like the minute you know what a triangle is, the minute you know what three sides means, you realize it's the same thing. It's self-evident. If I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Do I have to prove it? I mean, I can, but no, you just know it. You see it. It's a first principle. Suppose I say a triangle has four sides. Can I say that? I mean, I just did, but or 2 plus 2 equals 5. I just said it. Okay, but suppose I believe that. Can I then do geometry or arithmetic? A self-evident truth is not something you prove. It is something by which you prove everything else. It's a first principle of all subsequent knowledge. It's derived from very ancient philosophy. Euclid and all kinds of philosophers are fascinated with the way that the way we reason about anything, we always assume some kind of self-evident truth. So it is in arithmetic and geometry, so it is in life and politics. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It says that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, can never justly be taken away from you. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What other rights do we have? It says among these. Are there more? Maybe, but the declaration doesn't go into it. It just says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So yeah, where do your rights come from? The only rights that matter are your natural rights, and they come from your creator. It doesn't say God in a religious sense. It just says like creator in kind of a generic sense, deism, of the day. But still, it's a sort of view of the creator that pretty much everybody of whatever religious persuasion can agree with, and agree that if we have rights at all, they are not given to us by the state. They're given to us by our creator. All right, so what does that mean for government? That means that government exists to do what? Give us more rights? We tend to think of it that way today, but no. No, government exists to secure those rights, to protect those rights. That's why governments are instituted. And they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Very important principle. Very important for Congress, right? We consent to our member of Congress and our House, member of the House and the Senate, because we elect them, we vote for them. Now, maybe you didn't vote for that particular House member or Senate member, but still, the majority of your fellow citizens did, and so you consent to them. And you'll criticize them, and you'll say they should be voted out. Okay, fine. But still, you consent to their authority. You consent to the Constitution, right? That's what makes it legitimate. What does that mean? Whenever any government is destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter it, try to fix it if you can, or if you can't fix it, abolish it. That is, of course, the right of revolution, right? And to institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them, to the people, the sovereign, shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So why did the Declaration need this paragraph? It could have just said, we're mad at King George, he's done this to us, he's done that to us, we're declaring a revolution, Sons of Liberty, rah, rah, revolution. But instead we get this self-evident truth. But, does it go out of style? 1776, that's a long time ago, right? I mean, they wore buckled shoes back then and rode in carriages. It's so old, isn't it? Or is it still true? Is it, you might say, trans-historical? Does it transcend history and time? Let's keep this principle in mind and its place in American politics and certainly the life of Congress. We'll talk about this semester. And we'll see, too, how at every point in our history, when America commits crimes against its own people, and there are plenty of instances, we know that, it's usually because of a rejection of what you see here. At the same time, every advance in equality and dignity we see in our country and the greater inclusion of we the people, it's in the name of this principle. We always go back to this first principle in our founding. We do well when we do that. So we'll keep that in mind as we talk about Congress this semester. So yeah, Continental Congress then drafted the Declaration of Independence. Someone has a question? Oh, okay, no worries, Nick, no worries. They also made a very important decision in the Revolution. They called up the general, who would be the commanding general of the Continental Army, commander-in-chief, George Washington. Who else? And at this point, George Washington just had an extraordinary reputation for his selflessness, it seemed, for his absolute devotion to the Republic. And it was true through the course of the war, even though a lot of his commanding officers were ready to mutiny and rebel against the Continental Congress, Washington said, no way. Even though it was clear the Continental Congress didn't know how to run this war, even though they didn't let Washington choose his own officers, they kept a lot of control over the Continental Army. And at the same time, they would not help fund the army. All the while, though, Washington stayed absolutely faithful. And he executed that war with extraordinary precision and daring moves, like crossing the Delaware River, you know the story. And once it was pretty much over, it looked like the Americans had it. Before the war was officially declared a peace treaty over, Washington resigned. Because what did Washington want more than anything in the world? Political power and prestige. That's what generals wanted back in the old world, right? I'll go in wars for the sovereign, and in the end, I want castles and land. And if I don't, I'm going to storm the Capitol and demand it and declare myself a dictator. Did Washington want any of that? All he wanted was his farm, right? So, what an extraordinary model of self-restraint we find in him. And so the revolution is won. The United States defeats the most powerful empire in the world up against incredible odds, but they did it. And now they're on their own. And all this business of self-government and liberty, it's all nice in theory, but in practice, it's very messy. Governing ourselves is hard. It's kind of terrifying. We enter here the critical period. It is very critical because things are volatile. All of the states are separate and sovereign entities, and they're bound together by the Articles of Confederation. You have all of these state constitutions, many of them drafted in a hurry, many of them drafted to the sound of cannon fire in the distance. It's quite remarkable that they could put the amount of thought that they did into this in the middle of a war. Rumors about the British storming nearby cities, the possibility that they would all be hung for treason, but no. State assemblies met and drafted 13 state constitutions, which would later become models of the federal constitution. Overarching them all, though, the only federal constitution we had was the Articles of Confederation. It created a single house legislature, a single Congress. It required 13, a quorum of 13 of all 13 states, unanimous quorum to do business. It required unanimous votes to pass any kind of laws. It was slow and tedious. It got practically nothing done. It was weak and ineffective. It had no executive power to execute these laws. This could turn out very, very bad. Although, to its credit, it did pass one very important law, which we will talk about here in a couple of weeks, the Northwest Ordinance, governing the Northwest Territories. We'll get back to that later. But yeah, the situation is very volatile. Lots of extreme protests and demonstrations and violence sometimes in the states. Lots of disputes about state boundaries, no national government to oversee this all. But worst of all, wasn't so much the violence and the demonstrations as it was what was happening within the states. You had this problem of tyranny of the majority. Majorities of people electing their officials and flooding the state legislatures with those who represented their interests and just passing laws upon laws upon laws. Governors would veto these laws and say, no, these are unconstitutional. These are bad policy. And what would happen? The governors would be ignored, right? And they would just resign in disgrace. The state supreme courts, state courts would strike down the laws that they would pass as unconstitutional. And their salaries would be cut. And they would be threatened with impeachment. What's going on here? The tyranny of the majority is overtaking the legislatures, and the legislatures are out of control. And so you get these really awful laws in some states, some of them persecuting religious minorities. Jews faced all kinds of special taxes imposed on them, anti-Semitism, right? Quakers, a dissenting group of Christians faced with laws that had to make them wear badges in public and would regulate their commerce and all this kind of thing. But then you had the monetary problem. What was really popular in some of the states when it came to money? You got a lot of farmers. The farmers are trying to pay down the mortgages on their farms, and they realize they can do that if they inflate, if they overprint the currency. And so they elect their representatives to the state assemblies, and the state assemblies pass all kinds of laws that just print and print and print money. Well, what happens to the economy if you flood it with a whole bunch of cash? Econ majors, I know you're out there. Suddenly a loaf of bread costs $50. What is that? Yeah, Megan.
It loses value.
Yeah, you get what's called, it loses a value because of inflation. The money doesn't mean anything, and so you pay more and more. Pretty soon, what do people start doing? They start bartering. They start looking for alternate currencies. The state of Delaware was especially bad at this. Here's some the shillings from the state of Delaware. See if you can read it at the bottom. To counterfeit is death, right? And so Delaware actually passed a law that said if anybody used an alternate currency or counterfeit currency, they would be executed and denied a Christian burial. Now, do you think the state actually enforced that law? No, but it was trying to be very threatening. So here you have overprinting of currency and really heavy-handed laws to try to contain it. And meanwhile, inflation runs out of control. This is a big problem. Tyranny of the majority is a very dangerous threat to freedom. Watching all of this happen is a very important American founder who we will have a lot to say about this semester, James Madison of Virginia. He was not like other founders. He wasn't tall and dashing and respectable the way that George Washington was. He was short. He was very quiet and soft-spoken. He never smiled. He had this kind of solemn personality. He always wore black like Johnny Cash. But people who knew him found out that he had a brilliant, brilliant mind. He was like a boy genius, fluent in Greek and Latin and Hebrew at a very early age. Went to the College of New Jersey, which we know today as Princeton, and studied with some of the most brilliant minds of the day, John Witherspoon in particular, and really thought hard about how to design good governments, studying philosophy and history to understand the depths of human nature. And if you can get human nature right, Madison learned, then you can see exactly how to design a government that actually works and lasts, a self-government. He was thinking about this very early on. And he was deeply alarmed by tyranny of the majority in the states. He sent out a call for a convention to try to look over the Articles of Confederation and revise them. It was supposed to meet in Baltimore, and nobody showed up. what to do. Well, it didn't seem like anyone was going to take this seriously until an incident in Massachusetts. A very charismatic farmer named Daniel Shays pulled together a big group of farmers that were armed, like formed his own little personal army. And he marched them to Springfield, which was then the capital of Massachusetts, to overthrow the legislature there. Sound familiar? Violent mobs overthrowing legislatures. This is a common thing in American history. So it was with Daniel Shays. And the rebellion, Shays' rebellion that winter in 1786, 87, January, was just narrowly put down by an emergency state militia that was called up. But still, this spooked everybody. The states are much too volatile. Shays' rebellion, though, I mean, that was illegal, right? Tyranny of the majority, though, that's legal, but it's still unjust. We have to find some way to fix this legislative problem. So James Madison wrote a famous letter to George Washington. He said, what are we going to do? We need to get serious about calling a convention, and we need to propose a new plan. And so Madison enclosed in that letter for the first time a draft of a new constitution, which looks very much like what we ended up with. 3 branches of government, each of them given its own distinct powers through a system of checks and balances. Each of them authorized to exercise sovereign control over not just over the whole country, more than the Articles of Confederation did. Washington wrote back, he said, yep, this is a very good idea. Let's do it. And so the convention was called in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, Convention Hall. Has anybody been in Convention Hall? Much like Boston, all these historic places. There it happened, the room where it happened, right? Where the Constitution was drafted by 55 delegates from across the 13 states in the Constitutional Convention. Who were these people? George Washington was chosen to preside. It was the only unanimous decision in the whole event. And there he is presiding. And all the other delegates, what kind of people were they? They were all men. They were all relatively wealthy elites, a lot of them college educated. They were the kind of people who were in a position to assert power for themselves, to design a system that favored their interests and the interests of their class. And yet, as far as we can tell of what happened in the convention, and we have detailed notes from James Madison, nothing of the sort happened. They followed George Washington's model that there is far greater glory and fame in giving up power than in grasping it for yourself. And so the convention set to work. Initially, they thought they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. But James Madison rose to his feet and said, actually, no. And he passed out a sheet of paper to everybody. There was a printing press on site. Here's a draft of a new constitution. What? We can't do that. That's treason against our states. We were called here to do something else. No. Madison, just bear with me. We're not going to force it on the people. We're just going to draft it and then submit it to them for ratification. Okay. And so they went to work, going over each branch of government, its powers, clause after clause, all kinds of things proposed and then rejected. It's amazing how many things didn't end up in the Constitution compared to what we actually got. It was hot. It was the summer. George Washington ordered all the doors and windows closed because he didn't want the media finding out what they were up to. People were like hanging around outside trying to peek in the windows. The heat, though, was just intolerable. And of course, they're all in those velvet, coats and stockings, and it's just hot and sweltering. And inevitably, what happens when a group of people have to make a decision? Tempers start to flare, accusations, the heat doesn't help. Oh, this is going so bad. What was the major fight, though, at the convention? You've got 2 drafts of the Constitution, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan favored large states, population. That's how they should be represented in the legislative branch. The New Jersey Plan favored small states, just by being states. They would be represented the way they were under the Articles of Confederation. And so the fight between the large states and the small states and their delegates erupted. And it got worse and worse and worse, and they started threatening each other, and people started storming out. Finally, George Washington had enough. Washington hated people fighting about politics, and he hit the gavel, and he said, all of you get out of here. Come back when you can behave. But then he selected very carefully around the room some of the cooler heads, some of those who were a little more thoughtful, and he called them up and said, "Can you guys figure out a compromise? And when we come back, we will see what we can do to work out these tensions." And so the special committee was called, chaired by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And they came up with a very simple and elegant plan. Why don't we have a bicameral legislature, an upper house and a lower house? The lower house will represent the large states by population, the upper house simply by state. And we'll have two in the upper house per state. And a big thunderstorm rolls over Philadelphia, and the weather cools off, and everybody comes back, and they shake hands, and they apologize, and we're all friends again. And Roger Sherman rises to his feet and says, "Yeah, we came up with a compromise. Here we have it. Lower house by population, upper house by state." Oh, brilliant. Why didn't anyone think of this? Isn't it amazing how political anger can blind us to the most simple and obvious things? What a lesson. We have this impression that the founders were like wise and sagely demigods, but really they were just as human as the rest of us, deeply flawed, very self-interested. And so Roger Sherman saves the convention, saves the republic. Now, of course, that upper house and lower house becomes the House and Senate as we know it today. There was another compromise, though, a painful compromise. What to do about slavery, the compromise between the northern and southern states. It came up quite a bit at the convention. James Madison said a couple times, "What are we going to do about representation when it comes to slavery?" He says, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, the Declaration of Independence, right? A ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by one man over another. How has this happened?" Later in August, he said, "The convention thought it wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in other human beings." Yeah, people might think that back in the States, but the convention is not going to say that. We'll see in the Constitution in a minute where slavery shows up. But it's remarkable as you look through the original first 7 articles. Does it use the word slave anywhere? No, it calls them persons. Person held to service of labor, that's it. So, the Great Compromise, and of course the compromise on slavery. The last committee to go over a draft of the Constitution, you can actually see the drafts they had. It was printed on the printing press and then distributed, and their notes are in the margin. Everybody's thinking really hard about this thing. The Committee on Detail met, and they said, the names of these institutions, legislative branch, that's kind of boring. Let's call it Congress, like congregatio in Latin, to pull together like an assembly of people, right? And lower house, how about the House of Representatives? Upper house, in memory of ancient Rome, how about the Senate? The executive branch, how about the presidency? Judicial branch, how about the Supreme Court? They name the institutions and they go through and just scour the Constitution for every little detail and punctuation. And then finally that fall, as the weather is cooling off, the final draft is presented. There were a few dissenters. A handful of delegates said, "We refuse to sign this. It's not a good idea. The people in our states are not going to like it." But many others did. You see their signatures there. George Washington makes one last-minute modification. He says, representation in the House is by 1 for every 40,000 Americans. Let's lower that to 1 for every 30,000. And the convention doesn't debate it. No one questions him. Okay. That's really remarkable because you see in that moment how George Washington could have taken complete control of this convention, and he never did. Just right at the very end, he kind of shows his power on a very minor thing, and nobody says anything. This was an extraordinary accomplishment. Will the people accept it? That's the question. It's not going to be forced onto them. Instead, it goes public. It is printed in newspapers all over the country. And conventions are called in the states to decide whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So what did we get in the Constitution? It was in your packet, but I'll pull it up here on the screen and we'll look at it together. If I can find it. Where did it go? I was reading the Drudge Report, ignore that. Hold on. thought I had it up. Hold on a second. There it is. Okay. We the people. In order to form a more perfect union, says the preamble, more perfect than the Articles of Confederation, establish justice, it's obvious, ensure domestic tranquility, no more Shays rebellions, provide for the common defense, national defense, that has more to do with the presidency, but promote the general welfare. That becomes very important for Congress, right? Does it mean provide the general welfare? It comes to mean that, but in the preamble it says promote it. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Posterity is who? All of us, future Americans, right? Whether descendants or immigrants. We do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. And right at the top, our institution under Article 1. Article 1 creates Congress. Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, bicameralism, an upper house and a lower house. Vested, though, what does that word mean? I mean, it literally meant, in their language, putting on like a vest, like a robe that signifies your importance and your sovereignty. The legislative power then is vested, it is given to Congress. The realization that law normally restricts power, but in the Constitution, it grants power vested in a Congress. Section 2 is the election of the House of Representatives. The House shall be composed of members chosen every second year, so every 2 years, by the people of the several states. And the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the lower house of that assembly. So really that means all men, right? In some states, those who have a certain property level. Although the Constitution itself doesn't have a property requirement. It doesn't even have a gender requirement originally, or race for that matter. Those things were imposed by the states. As far as the federal Constitution is concerned, everybody can vote. There's no explicit restriction. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained, how old do you have to be? At least 25. And been 7 years a citizen of the US, right? You can be an immigrant, but you have to have been a citizen for 7 years. You shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of the state he is chosen. The only requirement is that they live in the state, not necessarily the district. Do you see anything about districts here? No, it's just that they're from that state. Districts are a state arrangement that comes later. And then it lays out proportion. How will people be represented? That 1 for every 30,000 rule, here's the original breakdown by state as it appeared in the Constitution. Of course, it changes dramatically over the course of American history. Also, what about slaves? They count for representation as how much of a person? This is the infamous, yeah, 3/5 clause, right? Now, what does that mean exactly? We often misunderstand that. We hear the 3/5 clause and we think this was a very racist principle from the founding that slaves were 3/5 of a human being. Is that what's going on exactly? This actually was a big moment in the convention, and James Madison writes about it in one of the Federalist Papers, number 54, where the Southern states say, well, we want to use our slaves for representation in the House. And James Madison says, okay, count them as whole persons then. No, we can't do that. Why not? Well, because then we'd be sort of acknowledging their personhood, and we don't want to do that. Why not? Okay, so count them as 0 persons, Madison says. Oh, we can't do that, says the Southern delegation. Why not? Well, because then we can't use them for representation. All right, so the compromise is 3/5, right? Just for the purposes of representation. That's where it actually comes from. And so we often forget what the 3/5 clause actually meant. That's the reason why. House of Representatives shall choose the Speaker. So we have a Speaker of the House established in the Constitution. And they shall have the sole power of impeachment. The impeachment power is in the House. Why does it appear here at the beginning? That's kind of a strange place to put it, but that's where you find it. Section 3 creates the Senate. It shall be composed of senators chosen every 6 years, long terms. They each shall have one vote. Senate elections were originally established how? How were senators originally elected in the Constitution? Actually, I'll put it back up, sorry. What does it say? They would be elected by state legislatures. Now that changes with an amendment to the Constitution in 1913, which we'll get to. But originally, yeah, the state legislature. So that meant that the senators were more insulated from the people. And they were chosen by the representatives of the people rather than the people themselves. And so, yeah, plus Senate elections are staggered so that only 1/3 of the senators are up for re-election at a given time, unless there's a special election like we just saw in Georgia. But normally, yeah. So that means that the House is turning over quickly, every 2 years, constantly up for re-election. The Senate is slow in its turnover. Plus, they have those long terms. So that means that senators have a much longer period of time to just be senators before they have to think about re-election. How old do you have to be a senator? At least 30. Of course, now we all know the story about Joe Biden being elected when he was 29, and he couldn't take his oath of office until his birthday, right? Back in 1968. He must have been 9 years a citizen, so he can be an immigrant, but he must be 9 years a citizen. He shall not, when elected, he must be an inhabitant of the state where he's chosen, right? He must be from that state. The vice president of the United States is the president of the Senate. However, if he's away on presidential duties, the Senate shall choose a president pro tempore, as it's called, which is like a substitute for the vice president, for the Senate to do its business in the absence of the vice president, and when he shall exercise the office of president of the United States, if something happens to the president. The Senate shall choose their officers. Oh, yeah, I read that, sorry. The Senate shall have the sole power to try impeachments. So the House impeaches, the Senate tries the impeachment. So the House indicts and says, yep, person's guilty. The Senate decides whether or not to remove them from office. When sitting for that purpose, they shall take an oath of affirmation. And when the President of the United States is tried, in extreme cases, the Supreme Court Chief Justice will preside. No person shall be convicted without concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So it's hard to remove an official from office. We usually think about impeachment in terms of the presidency, but other officials are impeached too. But how many presidents have been impeached now? It's been big in the news. How many? 3. Andrew Johnson in 1868 for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And then who else? Bill Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice in the Lewinsky scandal in 1998. And Donald Trump for the call to the Ukrainian president to try to get the dirt on the Bidens. And then more recently, for inciting a mob to storm the Capitol just a few days ago. The first president to be impeached twice, Donald Trump was. Now the question before the Senate is not, can we remove him? He's out of office, but can we bar him from future office? Bar him from running again in 2024. We'll see what the Senate says about that. So yeah, the power to impeach then. Judgment in cases of impeachment, though, shall not extend to removal from office. Can you go to jail for being impeached? No. What happened with Richard Nixon? He had impeachment charges, but they were not completed because he resigned. And then Gerald Ford pardoned him, as the president can do. So yeah, he almost was impeached. But yeah, the worst thing that can happen to you is removal from office. Section 4. 4 through 6 kind of go together. Is class over at, sorry, I forget what time it is. Let me check my schedule. Oh, we're done 11:20. Wait, yeah, 11:20. Okay, good. I was thinking 11:30. Is that right? So yeah, section 4 through 6 kind of go together. The times and places for elections of senators and House of Representatives, who arranges all that? The states do. It's the state's business. However, can Congress regulate those elections? Yes. So the states do the actual business of electing officials, as well as the president and the Electoral College. But Congress has the power to regulate the elections. The Congress shall assemble at least once a year, and such meetings shall be on the first day in December, unless they're moved to another day, which of course they are later. So yeah, once a year, because the other, most of the year, they are back home in their home districts. They have to be back home with their constituents. That's what it is to represent. Section 5, Each house is the judge of its own elections, returns and qualifications of its members. So that means, can the House and the Senate refuse to seat an official who was elected back in the state? Indeed, they can, and it has done this. They have done this before. The guy shows up who won an election and says, "I'm here to take my oath of office and be a congressman," and they say, "Nope, get out of here." We'll talk about the story of Adam Clayton Powell. A lot of people thought that this should have happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia a few weeks ago because she's very strange. We'll talk about her more later, but it didn't happen. They seated her. We'll see though what happens in the future. Each house must have at least a majority to do a quorum. A quorum is the number required to do business. All the Constitution requires, though, is a majority. The houses that can set it higher, make it unanimous or whatever. Each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. So the House and the Senate, as we'll see, each has the rule book that govern the way that they operate and the way they govern themselves. They can punish their members for disorderly behavior. With a concurrence of 2/3, they can expel a member. They can kick them out, right? So they have great authority over their own members, and they expect them to behave, and they expect them to abide by the rules. The House shall keep a journal of its proceedings. And so what we have is the congressional record, and you can look it up online. Most of it is digital now, and you can see the votes, and you can see the speeches. We'll look at a few congressional speeches from the congressional record this semester. Some of them are very famous. It is all public and open, unless the House says that they're dealing with something top secret, national security, but that's very rare. Practically everything Congress does is open to the public. It is a completely transparent institution in that way. Neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days. So that means they meet together and they adjourn together. House and Senate are always in unison. So yeah, that's kind of the rules of the way the houses are governed. Section 6 has more to do with the individual members. Senators and representatives shall receive compensation drawn from the Treasury. They get paid. So in other words, they tax us and then they pay themselves with our tax dollars. But Constitution says they can do it. And so, although there's a twist with that with the 27th Amendment, we'll get to that later. They shall, in all cases, except treason, felony, or breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest. Did you know this? They are protected from arrest. Or paying parking tickets, or any number of problems they might and trouble they might get into. Although, as it said above, they can be expelled. So as soon as they're expelled, then the law enforcement can come after them. But nope, they have a certain protection from ordinary criminal procedure. Yes, AJ.
What's the main reasoning behind that?
Yeah, good question. Why would they? Yeah, isn't that kind of? Shouldn't they be subject to the law like the rest of us? I think it's this realization that it's an expression of the fact that they are sovereign. They're like the sovereign elected officials. And so that means they deserve certain protections. However, again, if a member of Congress does something really bad, what can happen? They are expelled.
Removed.
Yeah, that's right. And then law enforcement can come after them once they're removed. So they're not totally free from criminal procedure. And of course, if it's treason or bribery, that there's no protection there.
Okay.
But yeah, it's an unusual thing, right? A lot of people don't know this is in the Constitution. No senator or representative can hold another office, neither back in their home state. You can't serve on the president's cabinet if you're in Congress. You can run for another office, but you can't hold another office. You can't have like a double oath. So there you have separation of powers, basic principle of the Constitution. Section 7 is the important one. And we'll talk a lot about this in this class. First of all bills for raising revenue. What's that? Taxes, right? Must originate in the House of Representatives, not the Senate, right? The Senate passes it, but they don't originate tax bills, only the House. And then here is the legislative process. If we were in person, I would show I'm just a bill, the cartoon. I'm just a bill, how it goes. You can find it on YouTube. How does it go though? Every bill must pass with a majority, the House and the Senate, or the Senate and the House. It can go both ways. And it shall, before it become law, be presented to the President of the United States. And if he approves it, he shall sign it. And it becomes the law of the land, deriving its authority from the Constitution. But if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House from which it originated. They shall enter the objections in the Congressional Journal and proceed to reconsider it. So they'll take the president's objections and try to fix it so that it meets what he wants. However, what else can Congress do? What's it describing here? It doesn't use the word, but this is, of course, the veto power, right? Veto in Latin means I forbid, right? But yeah, what can they do? What recourse do they have? They can try to fix the bill so the president will sign it, or if they have big enough majorities, override with 2/3 of majority in both houses. Is that easy? That's very hard, but they have that recourse, and it has happened a few times. We have a handful of laws, great important laws, that were made entirely by Congress over the president's veto. The president has other ways of vetoing. Suppose Congress is about to go out of session and he doesn't sign it and return it, and they leave and go home. That's a pocket veto, and some presidents have done that. Section 8, though, is really important. Here you have the powers of Congress granted by the Constitution. The most important power of all, you see it right up front. Congress shall have the power to tax, lay and collect taxes on duties, imposts, and excises. What about income? You don't see income there. Is that constitutional? Well, there was an amendment added later, right, that authorized income tax. And of course, today, that's where the federal government gets most of its revenue. We'll talk about the federal budget later. But yeah, the power to tax, and then the other side is provide for the common defense and the general welfare. That's, of course, the power to spend, taxing and spending. We'll talk about the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee. But yeah, those are the major levers of power within Congress. To borrow money to the tune of $24 trillion, or what are we at now? I think it's 24. Yeah, the Constitution doesn't express any limit. It just says to borrow. As long as they can pay it off, Congress can borrow. To regulate commerce with foreign nations in terms of trade, but also among the several states and with the Indian tribes, which at that time were regarded as separate sovereign nations. It's important to remember. Things change with Native Americans, as we'll see. But yeah, with the several states, though, that is the interstate commerce clause. So along with tax and spending power, commerce power becomes one of the most important tools that Congress has. Many, many laws that Congress passes, as we'll see, depend very much on the power to regulate interstate commerce. Now, originally, what did interstate commerce mean? Anything that crosses state lines can be regulated by Congress or taxed, right? So, okay, if a carriage carries a bunch of goods across state lines, the government can tax it. And it's amazing to think that for much of American history, that was where most federal revenue actually came from, just interstate commerce. Over time, though, what happens to the Commerce Clause? Anyone taking constitutional law? The clause gets really stretched to mean a variety of things, to the point where things that happen even within states are subject to commerce power. We'll talk about the New Deal later. We'll talk about Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. All of those laws depended very much on the power to regulate interstate commerce, as we'll see. So we'll come back to that. That's a really important line. After that, establish rule of naturalization for immigration, coin money. There's monetary policy. Punish counterfeiters, right, who print their own money. Can't do that. Make post offices. Promote progress in the arts and useful sciences with patents and copyrights. Establish inferior tribunals. Punish pirates. Declare war. And then it goes down through some of the more foreign policy related things having to do with Congress. Govern the military, providing the common defense. These are the enumerated powers of Congress. And the last one, though, is really important. Congress shall make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying the foregoing powers into effect, and all other powers vested in the Constitution or any department or officer thereof. So that's the elastic clause, as it is called, this broad grant of power given to Congress to do what it needs to do. When we come back, let's look at a little bit more of Article 1, Section 9 in particular. 9 are just a handful of prohibitions on Congress. And we'll look at the rest of the Constitution. And then we'll talk about ratification. I meant to get to the Federalist Papers today. My apologies, I kind of threw my schedule off. Those of you who've studied with me before know I do this. I'm going to try really hard to not get as behind as I usually am this semester. But yeah, we'll talk about the Federalist Papers next time, as well as Sentinel, the anti-federalist who doesn't like Congress. And then read chapter 1 of the very short introduction to U.S. Congress, and we will discuss those things on Friday. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all on Friday.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Professor.
Thank you.
Question? Hey, Kayla.
Kyla.
Or Kyla, sorry. Kyla.
It's fine.